Здравствуйте, товарищи! Welcome to the 5th episode of the Russian Bias Podcast. As of October 2014, it's my birthday! Yeah! Matt's excited.
No one cares.
Matt's back, by the way. As you can see, no one cares.
I'm back.
That wasn't a very that was a pretty awkwardly placed joke, wasn't it?
Yes.
Okay. He's doing a good job of this this whole making the situation awkward thing. Okay.
I've accepted my role as a cyborg.
Yes. Yeah, he's coming into grips with that sort of thing now. Of course, whenever we plat, Matt, I must admit, I do kind of make an effort to do more damage than you. Somewhat.
And you tend to fail miserably.
Not a whole lot. Yeah, I know. I try, though. My stats are getting better. I am now... My 60-day WN8 is now in the green. So that's a nice change of pace.
Okay, well, I mean, you're just going to brag about that to all of our listeners out there. Okay, all right.
Matt, you can brag, too. I mean, you know, you
could, except that I don't do that stuff.
Okay. Matt's good, folks. Trust me. Or trust him. Something a little different this time around. Once again, we're gonna talk a little bit about War Thunder and World Tanks, but we're not necessarily gonna go over the patch notes for War Thunder's newest update because it's still sitting around in the dev server. I don't know why it's still sitting around in the dev server, but that's just kind of the way it is. But anyway, let's get on to it. So, if anyone's been paying attention to the forums lately, Gaijin sort of made their stance on matchmaking for realistic battles, what they want to do with it, known. And if I pull up the article here exactly... Awkward pause. Awkward pause. Filling up this space in conversation with my meaningless gobbledygook. Okay, here we are.
It's not really a conversation though, is it? Like you're just kind of speaking.
Somewhat, yeah.
You know,
I guess that's more accurate.
Or singing.
But now I'm at the article, and basically, there have been very mixed results about this. And I'll actually include a link to this article. Well, not really an article. I'll include a link to this post in the video description down below. But Todes here on the forums bluntly puts it at the beginning, the team and I often get questions like, what's with the battle ratings thing? I don't think that needs any further clarification.
I think we've beaten that horse.
Oh, gosh. Anyway.
We've beaten that horse enough.
But he kind of goes on, given his interpretation of it and, you know, some of the problems that come along with the battle rating system. Not like the community hasn't talked about that already. But he says, in the end, our follow-up program will be to completely remove battle ratings from realistic battles. Bravo.
If you could hear me clapping, I would be clapping.
Bravo.
Right now. But
good job. Instead, we will have tables which will show what vehicles of what country can meet each other in the battle. Okay, good first step. What else do we know about it? This table will be available to be viewed by players directly inside the game. Uh-oh. So we're going to have a lot of people disagreeing with that, but that's okay. First step, right? We will also have a balance weight for the country pairs under the hood, meaning if vehicle can meet another vehicle, it won't mean that they will meet often and in equal proportions. So, it's almost like battle rating, but it's not really battle rating. Huh? It's good, huh? So basically, that's cool. Kinda. They're not specifying whether they're doing it for, like, historical matchmaking or not. Which...
I don't know, I would guess so.
I would imagine.
They tend to throw those two together.
But the problem I think that could potentially come about with that is that certain people would not be able to agree upon whether or not, like, X vehicle entered frontline service at this date, or whether they define a vehicle that entered frontline service or, like, is applicable to be included in a historical context. Like, some people may say that if it didn't come out of the prototype stage, then it's not a real, it's not a official thing. Shouldn't be included in the game. Some people are okay with physical, like, models of the plane or tank actually being made and actually being tested. It's a very, very ambiguous, it's a very difficult, uncanny valley to kind of cross when you're talking about a game like War Thunder, which is supposed to blend in kind of all that stuff, but yet maintain some level of historical authenticity, try to kind of balance all those things. Fun, historical accuracy, and balance. And it goes on to say, that was the first point about, completely removing battle rating from realistic battles. And it goes on to say, for top ranks, it's okay, so like 5th era, we're going to implement mixed nation battles. In fact, there are some kind of mixed battles already. 4 or 5 nations have MiG-15s or F-86s, true. But for matchmaking, it's harder to make a good match. Yada, yada, yada. Now, here's the thing. And you can go and read the full dissertation in the link below. I'm not just going to quote everything that Tode says, because that would be a little bit unfair. Wouldn't be giving him that much credit for writing that up. But it's, again, it's a very, very fine line to tread here. Because if you're going to implement mixed nation battles at the 5th rank, for the sake of gameplay balance, how are you going to do that? Are you going to do it like Axis versus Allies? Are you just going to have a whole bunch of planes flying against each other like in arcade battles? What's going on? Okay, so like option A is just completely throws historical authenticity out the window. I hope I didn't mix those up. Completely integrating everything will throw historical authenticity out the window. And having, like, Axis versus Allies isn't quite as bad, but there are going to be certain events and certain kind of maps where it's just not going to make sense. So, how do where's the distinction drawn? How are we setting this up? Again, there's a lot of information. It would be a lot easier
for them to determine this. They have a lot more. They go past World War II, which, that's not necessarily a bad thing for them, and honestly, it was a decision they probably had to make because the later tiers are going to be affected by it. But I think the main issue they're going to come up with is there are not giant jet battles in World War II. It wasn't a thing. Mm-hmm. And if they try to, and they have to basically make it a thing. And regardless of how they handle it, it's probably going to be perceived badly. So they're most likely not focusing on that. I think they're focusing on probably the lower tiers around 3 and 4, or even 2, where they can have planes that they can work with that maybe did work in tandem, i.e., the invasion of Normandy or something like that. Where
like
British
Britain and
planes,
America,
American planes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the German and Japanese, like if they're going to have Axis versus Allies, then that's kind of difficult, considering they didn't really have like a combined operation together, save transferring of an Enigma code machine in the Southwest Pacific,
and like loaned aircraft, that kind of stuff.
And stuff like that. But they didn't really operate their air forces, armies, or navies like in the same operating area at the same time. So something like that seems kind of odd to me.
Especially if you're talking about like
maybe
like this is just concerning planes at the moment. But if you get into tanks and ships, especially ships,
yeah, that especially.
The German Navy did not do combined arms operations with the Imperial Japanese Navy, as far as I know. But I'm willing to bet that never happened. So, what is this going to look like further down the line? For the most
part, yeah. And the only, shipborne operations that the Germans did, actually do involve pocket battleships or or especially the U-boats, of course. But, they were very limited on the amount of ships they could produce and could field because they had a limited number of ports that weren't basically under the watchful eye of the British or even the Russians in the north.
And you have, for the Allies, the USSR and pretty much every other Allied country. I mean, as far as I know, the USSR and America and the UK didn't have any, like, combined arms operations that were recorded anyway.
Well,
but there was a very it was a definitive front. Like, there were different sectors of combat: Western Front, Eastern Front, Pacific,
right,
Europe. And if you want to keep your historical authenticity here, you gotta be really careful where you go with this, because you have to make sure that the missions are set up in a manner that's going to please everybody, and it's not going to be easy. I don't think it's entirely possible either. But if you want to start somewhere, if you're talking specifically about realistic battles, and arcade battles, you know, a bunch of planes and a bunch of tanks fight each other, and that's okay. But if you're talking about realistic battles, when you know, the whole point of it is, you know, realistic battles, you know, it says it in the name. So, kind of giving an example of one of the problems that I think, if you were to come to me and say, what's the biggest problem with War Thunder right now? Coming as a person who primarily plays realistic battles, oh, well, you certainly give off the impression that you play mainly arcade, but shut up. Coming from someone who primarily plays realistic battles, I would say the biggest problem isn't necessarily battle ratings. Again, they need to be kind of fiddled with. I wouldn't say it's necessarily flight models. There's a more notable underlying problem here, and I think that's the mission structure. And I think that's ultimately what's keeping a lot of people away from realistic battles. I mainly play whatever event is available. Like, if I'm going to go on to War Thunder, what I'll primarily do now is go into realistic battles like the event list. So Guardian Angel or whatever comes up. I tend to stick away from the realistic battles matchmaker because a lot of the setups that I get into are just either completely nonsensical or just not really all that fun. The matchmaker especially has to be kind of tailored in favor of these really, really wacky setups, like, you know, again, mixed nation battles or alternate history battles, like, you know, circa 1946, America versus the USSR, or something wacky like that. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that on a gameplay standpoint, but at the same time, you know, I would like to play a game that kind of focuses a little bit more on that sort of authentic side of it. For instance, I played War Thunder today before we did this recording here, and I'm actually, I'll play the video over top of this audio track while we're at it. I looked at the event list, and it was for Pearl Harbor. So, obviously, Japan versus America. Now, we can talk about how, like, historically speaking, how this event actually happened, and how there weren't any P-40s or P-36s flying around shooting zeros down. But, for the sake of gameplay, this is what they have set up here. It's basically, like the basic idea they have set up here is Japanese are on the offensive, and the Americans are defending key points, ships, from Japanese bombers. But the problem here lies in the fact that the objective in question, which for the Japanese is to take out the ships, is irrelevant, practically speaking, because there's easily over 18 ships to blow up, and only so many bombers that the Japanese have in their hands, and they're going to miss a couple of bombs. So, what you essentially have here is the Japanese have an option in this event of choosing between the Zero, the Kate, and the Val. So, the torpedo bomber and the dive bomber. No one's going to be flying the bombers, because you're just going to be down zeros. The Americans have the choice of flying the P-40, the P-36, or the SBD. No one's going to be flying the SBD, because you're going to be down P-40s that are going to try and shoot down the zeros. Your objective as the Americans isn't even to blow up ships, so why would you even bother with that? I don't even know why that option is included in the system. So, what you have here, basically, are a bunch of Japanese Zero fighter planes who are outnumbered by the P-40s that the Americans have, And supposedly, theoretically, that balance is supposed to be kept by the fact that they have bombers, and the Zeros are acting as a bomber escort, the dive bombers. But again, the objective is just so outlandishly, like, impossible to do that there's really no point in escorting the bombers. So what you have is another glorified deathmatch. And the Japanese, okay, the Zero doesn't have really all that much in terms of ammo capacity. It's not as fast as a Kitty Hawk. It'll get outrun by it if it tries to get away, tries to RTB. And, of course, the American fighter planes are well known for their ability to stay around for long periods of time in combat because they got machine guns, and machine guns have a lot of ammunition. You know, you're able to carry around a lot of ammunition. So you have all of this active, like, it's a battle between active combat time, and America, in this particular event system, is going to win 7 times out of 10, if not more than that. Who the hell wants to do that? That's not fun to me, you know? It's no fun getting seal clubbed, or seal clubbing yourself. I mean, some people are, you know, who are of questionable morality do find seal clubbing fun, but for the most part, if you're trying to aim for a balanced game, this isn't the way to do it. Now, if you take something like Guardian Angel in the events list, which is by far my favorite mission in the whole lineup, it is the most, I would argue it's the most balanced one, if you're looking for a good objective-based event. Because the way it works is that it's America versus Germany. America is escorting bombers, okay? Their fighters, the P-51 and the P-47, were designed for high-altitude fighter escort, so there's their historical authenticity. At this particular time, Germany was wielding Bf-109s and Me-410s to shoot these guys down. Okay, so you keep that. And the basic idea here is that the Germans have to shoot down these bombers, or the bombers are going to blow up this objective. If the objective gets blown up, Germany loses, period. You know, it's not based off of who loses all their planes first. If America, if the bombers aren't able to blow up the objective, America loses. It's a very, very clear fail and success state for both sides here. That doesn't necessarily have to revolve around shooting down all the planes. Now, why they don't have more matches like this confuses the living hell out of me. Because if they just kind of sat down and they went, okay, so let's set up something here that actually kind of makes sense from a gameplay and a historical authenticity perspective, a lot of people look at the ME-262 and they go, oh, gee whiz, I don't want to fly against jets. If you did something similar to like an asymmetrical setup, like Guardian Angel, for instance, whole bunch of P-51s escorting a formation of B-17s from a flight of ME-262s. That would be balanced. That would work. That would totally work. I mean, I can't, you know, or at least I imagine it would work. At least put it up on the dev server and let people test it out and see what they think of it. You know, I think they're overcomplicating the problem. I don't think it necessarily has to do.
They're just not giving it a shot.
Yeah,
I think is the thing.
Yeah.
I think it could work as well. Like it just makes sense to me. But I mean, to them it may not. But
I mean, Gaijin's
asymmetrical warfare is part of warfare. Not every battle is going to be a fair battle. But that doesn't necessarily mean it can't be balanced. I mean, the numbers are. I mean, that is the most obvious difference. And this could really apply in War Thunder, is flight time, ammunition, things like that. And even, I mean, those are factoring elements in balance. And they very well could be able to balance something as just, you know, simple as P-51s versus Me-262s. There's more P-51s, less Me-262s. Me-262s have less ammo because they have cannons. And the P-51s have 50 cals. And then the 262s will probably have less flight time. You know, I mean that seems perfectly fair to me.
Because they were built as interceptors. If you model it, you know, you can model the historical aircraft just as long as the mission is set up in a way that, you know, doesn't give a huge advantage to either side. And then again, you kind of get into this issue.
The only thing.
Go ahead.
The thing that I think people would complain about, though, and I feel like this would happen, so I understand why they're not doing this in a certain sense, is that if you're in the ME-262 and you're getting in a sticky situation, you just run away. Like you really could.
Well, if you don't shoot down the bombers, then that would be the end of the objective. So
right,
that's the way that would be counteracted.
Right, but exactly. So they have to have a objective that they have to focus on. Otherwise, they're not gonna be able to succeed. Now, something like the bombers would definitely work. Although, I think that's a very what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very specific case, I think, with the bombers.
Yeah.
I'm sure they could think of other ideas if they actually put their minds to it. But I think that's the trouble.
Just look at the way the battles were set up. I mean, every air force and every army kind of had their own way of doing things. Like the USSR, as opposed to the Americans, didn't have a lot of they didn't really have any high altitude fighter escorts because the engines just couldn't do it. But they often had circle formations around IL-2 Sturmovix flying at low altitude. And what the Germans would try to do is try to come in. German fighter pilots would try to come in and get these quick kills. That's again why they have a lot of these cannons, was so they could get out a huge amount of damage in a short amount of time, so that way they could make an attack run and then fly away. And the Russians would have to find a way to coax them down to their level. It's just the dynamic here, and you can work a little bit more with like escorting tanks and naval combat, things of that nature. I think that if you just look at what actually happened, you have a lot of material here. That's sort of a double-edged sword with historical games, is that it's not like a game like chess where you can just set up however the heck you want it for the sake of balance. You kind of have to keep a little bit of a historical aspect here in order to keep everybody happy, in order to have a fun game. But you can have your cake and eat it too, I think.
Right.
A lot of people go, you can't have both. I disagree with that completely. Completely. You can't have an extreme of either
run into, though.
Yeah.
The problem they're going to run into, though, is most likely with the naval warfare, which we don't have any information on, basically, and we're not exactly sure how it's going to work. But if it's anything similar to ground forces in the air,
shouldn't be taken off from
we're going to have arcade. Yeah, we're going to have arcade, realistic, and historical battles. Now, the trouble with that, the historical battles, I mean, that's a very small pool to choose from as far as like actual events that happened. And I think the trouble they're going to run into is they're going to have to come up with scenarios that seem, at least viable. Because there's not really much to choose from as far as naval combat is concerned, except for, say, America versus Japan. There's plenty of that, but Germany is a bit left out, considering they've already confirmed that U-boats will not be a factor. Mm-hmm. Which I understand why it's not. They're very difficult to balance. So they'll leave in battleships, battle cruisers, etc., etc. Right, and that's and you basically have to go a whole nother level. You have above the sea, on the sea, and below. So suddenly you're having to basically rethink your entire idea of ship combat if you throw those into the mix. So I understand why they're not doing it. But unfortunately, that was Germany's main contribution to naval warfare, was with the U-boats. A majority of the tonnage that they sunk was not sunk by the pocket battleships that they had patrolling down in the waters and these merchant ships that they would put guns on. They did not sink most of the ships. It was the U-boats. But with them not being in the game, it's just kind of a bit of a hole that needs to be filled. And I think they will take this and they'll most likely create missions, sort of like the alter reality, perhaps. Say the Bismarck wasn't sunk and sunk the hood and then sunk, even more ships, and suddenly Germany becomes a great naval power. And then suddenly there's a giant fight between the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy versus the Germans or something of the sort.
See, I would find that interesting,
because that's basically the only thing I could think.
Yeah. But the thing is, you got to set it up properly. Not like this one
Right.
other mission that I want to change topic soon enough, but like there's another mission that just really I can't even get my head around it. It's this USA versus Russia thing where they attack in like this big city, and there's these several objectives here that the Americans can blow up if they feel like it. But why bother when you can just shoot everything down?
Right.
I mean, it's just it
and
feels
I think that's the trouble of only having the one life.
I think Gaijin had their expectations too high with how like large the scale of these battles would be, and if we're gonna stick with the same number of people in each match and on each team, you have to condense it. You have to, or else it's just gonna be bland and uninteresting. Okay.
And you're right about it just devolving into a death match, and I know it's frustrating to watch because you're in there and you're trying to complete the objectives you're given, or you could just save yourself about 30 minutes and just destroy every enemy fighter in the air.
You'll have like two guys flying in bombers, and they'll usually get shot down because they don't have a fighter escort. Because they're on their own.
And something that they did in ground forces, I think, to remedy that was to give limited respawns, and I understand why they do that because it prolongs the mission. It makes it so you can't just end the mission almost immediately by just destroying all enemy tanks, which sometimes it takes a matter of 4 or 5 minutes for that to happen. Tanks, while it seems kind of weird, seem to be a bit more fragile. In that regard, at least, when going against
they're more
tanks,
susceptible to fail-safes
and aircraft. Right.
Because whereas with the plane, I mean, if you're paying attention, then you can evade a head-on or a boom. But in a tank, one HE shell and so yeah, there's that. Moving on from that, we go over to another game with tanks in it. I would think. And I think we can both agree that the mission structure there, albeit is a little bit more simple, but it's, I would say, more. I would say set up a little bit more properly. Sparingly said.
It's definitely. I think it's more effective at what it's trying to do, because it realizes. Like we were talking about World of Tanks. We didn't actually say that, but I mean.
I thought we were talking about Red Orchestra. No.
Oh, of course. Actually, would you mind if we mentioned that a little bit later on, though? Because that's something we've kind of mentioned it recently in some of the other Russian bias videos. But it actually has a really cool mechanic that I actually like to talk about, and that I actually got a bit more familiar with since the last time.
Yeah, it's an episode about mechanics.
Anyway,
why not?
But World of Tanks. But yeah, it has a very simple system. It's I mean, there are different game modes to add a bit of variety, but for the most part, if you destroy all the enemy tanks and all of you and enough of yours are alive, that's great, and you win the game, and that's awesome. Likewise, if you lose all of your tanks or your objectives get captured, etc., you lose, and that's pretty simple, and it's something you can explain to someone, and something you can tell, like, all right, this is how you win, this is how you lose. It's very defined, I think. So yeah.
9.3. If you take a look at it, mainly talked about or mainly addressed internal stuff, structural stuff, which I think is pretty much the most logical thing to approach with World of Tanks right now. You don't necessarily need more content because you have a lot of stuff to choose from in the sandbox. Particularly what they've been doing a lot as of late is map reworks, and the one that we came across in this patch was Muravenka, and I was very glad to see this map get adjusted.
I mean, Champavenka. As it was affectionately or
God, I hate this. I hate this map so freaking much. Oh my gosh, because like I primarily play mediums. Well, I used to primarily play TDs, and then I realized that I sucked at them, and so now I mainly do like flanking mediums, particularly the Ruskies, as you can see in some of the gameplay clips that I have put up here. But oh my god, if you were in a medium tank on this map, or like a scout or something, that relied on moving around a little bit more than the heavies. If your team did not get their ass in gear At some point, you just kind of had to sit there and go, well, guess I'll just sit here for the rest of the match. Because if I go up here, I die. And that would not be helpful. So, just gonna sit here. And that's kind of the problem that a lot of maps had before, and they're starting to get fixed. El Halef had a similar treatment where they pretty much made it less campy. It flows a little bit better now. If you look at Muravanka in particular,
and a bit more heavy tank friendly.
Yeah, but if you look at Muravanka, you'll notice that there's this one particular part of the map that everybody loves to talk about and make jokes about, the magical forest. Well, now it's still a forest, but it's not quite as, magical. There's not as many
Romulan. It's not quite magical.
There's not as many Romulan cloaking devices lying around this time. The TDs, if they don't position themselves correctly, are still gonna get shot. They're still gonna get spotted, which I think promotes a more healthy metagame, because again, every single role that you have in the game needs to have some degree of importance, unless it blows up Matt, in which case, In which case, I'll be quite angry, and I'll say it should be removed from the game.
I'm looking at you, Artie. Really, I haven't met a good Artie player ever. Like a good.
What about
meaning,
the 263 in that one match
I
we
would
were in?
like.
Remember that? He was good.
263. 261.
Sorry, 261.
I know
It's got a gun. It's got tracks. Same thing.
It's got a gun. It's got tracks. It's Russian. And it says object. Yeah, whatever.
The 3002D and the 3001D and the 3002M, pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, the same tank. Same tank. That's another discussion for another time. But oh gosh, don't get us started. Anyway, I really mean no offense to you Artie players. You just have killed me enough times that I hate your guts. Not you personally, just Artie in general. So if I ever sound annoying, this will probably happen if whenever I'm on this podcast, I'll probably end up bringing I hate artillery, I hate artillery, I hate artillery. But it's not you that I hate. All right, just understand that I mutually hate everybody. I just hate you guys just slightly a bit more. So you're all equally worthless to me. So I'm completely kidding. Even though artillery does frustrate me as well as many other players, I understand it's part of the game, and I haven't quite accepted that fact completely.
See, the divide between Matt and I, the divide between you and I is that I primarily play tanks that have a little bit more mobility, and you're the big hunk of metal, heavy tanks pushing around.
Call me fat.
Well, it's nothing. It's not really fat. More,
big.
Yeah, big. Let's go with that. Which is
also fat.
Okay. That's your own personal interpretation of it. Personally, armor. Loads of armor. No, but yeah, it's really I do feel for you, because it is really annoying. And I don't really play that many heavy tanks, but whenever I do play heavy tanks, without fail, I'll get to a certain choke point and then just get hammered into pieces and go, oh, right, this is why everyone hates it. Because it is a pain in the butt. You just get, removed from the match by, the hand of God. You don't even see the guy. It's just kind of oh, okay, I just got deleted. So that's the end of that match. But aside from that, the metagame in World Tanks, I would say, is definitely a little more evened out. And they did kind of take a stab at it with light tanks in this patch 9.3 again, because they just added a whole bunch of light tanks. Until now, France and China were the only nations that had light tanks up to tier 8. Well, now America, Russia, and Germany have their own line that goes up to tier 8. So for America, you got the T-37 at tier 6, which is pretty chunky for a light tank, but it still moves around, in the traditional kind of, quick and nimble light tank fashion. Very, very good gun, very good DPM. The Walker Bulldog, that is just a sexy looking tank. Does that not just say, like, American tank to you? That's just a
Well,
nice. I mean, I just think it's a cool.
I
look
at the T-29. I see, America,
yeah,
but
yeah.
uh,
But T-29 is really big and
but yes,
bombastic.
it does.
You know.
Yeah, it's a heavy tank, and I think the Walker Bulldog is basically, I would call it the equivalent at a light tank of just being big, but
they're really
but,
meaty.
more like a buff.
The American lights they're closer to medium tanks than some of the other light tanks in the game. I mean, they're still classified that way. But they do serve a really, really interesting niche in the game, I do think. Light tanks, depending on how they're implemented. Because up until this point, and this isn't completely true across the board, but up until this point, light tanks primarily just served as scouts. Well, now you have a lot of really effective flanking vehicles in this lineup. Particularly the Chaffee and the Walker Bulldog. And you have a gimmicky kind of tank at Tier 8 for America as well, which was still a good tank in itself, I would say. Even if the gimmick is a little
I've seen it
ridiculous.
Do ridiculous amounts of damage.
Yeah, the T-49.
And I've seen it do about 50 damage and go, oops, and then get just destroyed.
Yep.
It's just going to be one of those tanks. You're going to either have good games, like really good games in it, or just really bad games in it.
Really fast
and I think
too.
that's exactly what they wanted it to be.
Yep.
And people are gonna drive it.
It's the closest thing
because
that's Sheridan,
I mean, they like that high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing wrong with that. So yeah.
No, absolutely.
America gets some pretty beefy kind of flanking combat vehicles for their newer light tank line. I guess you would call the autoloaders a light tank line too, but it wasn't primarily focused on the lights. Mainly people would go down there to get to the T-57 heavy. And you get to the Russians. They had a light tank up to Tier 6 called the T-50-2, and then they got rid of it and replaced it with the MT-25, which is just the most awkward vehicle at that tier, I would say. It's just kind of like, it's a scout.
It's funny.
It's a fat scout. It's big. It has a fair amount of hit points, but I think the MT-25 and a couple other tanks are somewhat of a victim of power creep, and that's inevitable whenever you introduce elements into the sandbox. But now the Russians get a little bit more... they get a little more fun. The L2TB, which is kind of a quirky tank in itself. A good gun and a good platform, but the gun depression is just kind of like, what? It's like, I can't aim my gun down.
It seems to be quite a weird Achilles heel to throw at the Russians.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not known for their great gun depression, but, I mean, China was generally the one that had, none. Like, practically none. I mean, this thing's practically Chinese. Which, I don't know, it's an interesting... It shows that they're willing to throw in a bit more ideas as far as balancing goes, rather than sticking to hit points or armor or the armament. So I like it. I think this is I think it's a cool introduction, and one that people are just gonna have to get used to. You can't shoot over the hill. Well,
yeah. Well, if you look at both the LTTV and the T-54 lightweight, I mean, they're really kind of brawly oriented tanks, which is fitting for the Russian mediums because they're kind of built that way.
Right, but they're
side scraping and flanking,
which seems really strange. Which seems really strange to people.
Yeah, a lot of people have looked at the T-54 lightweight and they gone just like, oh, it's OP. And I mean,
well,
I can't say anything about
here's
that
the
personally.
Thing. A lot of that's coming from T-44 drivers because it's more or less. I mean, it's better than the T-44, albeit it dodoes have worse matchmaking than us, considering it goes up one more tier. Or not up one more tier, but technically yes, but it'll see tier 10s a lot more than we do. But Greg and I are currently on the T-44, and coming from people that are on it, we don't really see, at least I don't see, what all the fuss is about. I find the T-44 to be a great tank, I really do, and would I like the T-54 lightweight? Yeah, absolutely. I feel it's a great machine. It's a fast T-54. It's got some good armor. It's got great speed. But I still like my T-44. It has a certain aura to it that's It's just different about
It's a
it,
medium
and it's
driver's
definitely
medium.
a step up from the T43. Yeah,
Very
absolutely. Very. So I think the 54 lightweight's a really good addition to the game. Moving on from that, I'm not sure if you wanted to move on, but
well, we got one more thing to talk
I think
about,
we should
though.
go ahead.
Germany
We
has.
do.
I mean, they have a really, really quirky light tank line. They're not really well known for their light tanks.
Right.
I mean, they have the Awful Panther, which isn't all that awful. I mean, it's
Right.
It's
kind of a bad reputation,
but
I think.
it's a light tank that weighs what, 40 tons?
Almost. I think it's 37.
It's on the chassis of a Panther.
It's a big light tank.
It's a big old light tank, which was a quirky vehicle in itself. But now they have something, to kind of serve as an alternative to the engine Panzer, the Spähpanzer RU-251. But holy crap, this thing looks so fun! I want one in my garage right now!
That's great. It was so much fun.
Oh my goodness. It's like... It is just a pure light tank. It's like, oh, well, it has auto-pen armor. Who cares? It's really, really freaking fast, and that gun...
They said the same thing
great.
about the Leopard.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much it's a baby leopard. The baby leopard.
Pretty much.
I mean, that's
awesome.
awesome.
It's a great introduction into that line.
Quickie Baby
which
made a
is
video.
exactly what it leads into.
Yeah. I think that if you're going down the leopard line, if you want to get more acquainted with what's going on, I would argue to go with the light tank line rather than the engine Panzer line, because you'll get a more comfortable feel of what you're going to experience at Tier 10 and Tier 9. Very, very fun tank. And I think it's really cool that they've gone out of their way to take a look at this part of the meta, because for a long time, light tanks just kind of sat around in limbo for a while. Like I said before, just scouts. Now, China, I guess you could debate whether China or not got power creeped into oblivion with the release of 9.3. But I still see the WZ-132 used, so I'm going to assume that it still has some kind of use. But until now, I mean, later tiers, like Tier 8, and Tier 8, 9, and 10, and the Tier 8 tanks can see up to Tier 10 matches, were pretty much just, like Brawl Fests. And occasionally an AMX 1390 or a WZ-132 would help you get lights. Like, as in spots. The further up you go in the in World Tanks progression system, the more brawly, slower you tend to get. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but it's not quite as interesting, I would say. I think the meta at Tier 8 wasn't quite as interesting as it was. Or I should say the meta at Tier 8 now is more interesting than it was before the introduction of 9.3. And again, just looking at, like, little gaps here and there that kind of need to, it wouldn't hurt to take a look at them and add a couple more things to them. That's how you do post-launch support. That's how you keep a free-to-play game alive. Nothing particularly wrong with that. Now, this is good to do with a game like World of Tanks because it's relatively, it has a competitive community, it's stabilized, it has its metagame firmly established. War Thunder, there's nothing wrong with introducing content, but you need to have a proper backdrop in order to put the content into. You can go a little overboard. Nothing particularly wrong with giving the Japanese and the Germans better jets at later tiers, but again, look at what you're putting them into first. Because it doesn't matter how much content you have in the game, as long as, if it's not structurally sound, no one's going to care, okay? Chess is commonly regarded as the definitive, balanced board game in the world, and yet it's just a couple of, like a series of pieces versus the same series of pieces, turn-based. It's relatively simple, but it has a lot of depth. World of Tanks has a lot of depth, too, albeit it's simple from, if you just take a look at it. So War Thunder can be simple, and War Thunder can be a little more complex, I should say, and have depth. It just has to be approached in a more meticulous manner.
Right.
But yeah, that's that. There were also several tanks that were rebalanced in 9.3, like the KV-1.
And Greg's quite happy about that.
Yes.
And
yes.
And as someone who had one, and who now has... Actually, well, I had a KV-85 in my garage, and as soon as I realized that it was nerfed to oblivion, I sold it. nothing really against the new one, but I'm going down the Russian heavy tank line as well, and it's just
to give you guys an idea
the
of how
100
much...
millimeter gun is.
Sorry, go on.
No, you're good. The 100 millimeter gun is basically the only gun you can use on the KV-85 anymore. I'm sure the 122 works from time to time, but if you want a gun on a tank that can work, a majority of the time, you will not use that gun. It's when it says 0.5 accuracy, it means 0.5 accuracy. This thing, I barely ever hit my target in the probably 10 games I played after this patch. And I was just like, nope, I'm not going to deal with this. I've already progressed through this thing. I don't need it. And I'm just not going to deal with it. So
just to give you an idea of how much I freaking hated the KV-1S, I wanted to go down the Russian heavy line, like the IS-7 line, but I actively avoided the KV-1S by going through it from the KV-13. That is how much disdain I had for that thing. It just, Tier 6 is a better place without it. Sorry. Had to be said. Sorry.
And at the same time, they also added a bit more depth to Tier 5 by throwing the actual KV-1S, not the KV-85, back down to Tier 5 as a faster
alternative
KV-1S.
The KV-1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it makes an interesting tank down there. I haven't actually played it myself.
Because the KV-1's not necessarily.
I may end up picking up one of these days. Right, exactly. It has its own strengths and weaknesses, exactly how it should. And there's nothing, that's particularly, crazy about it. It's faster. It has slightly less armor, and it has a similar selection of guns. So, I mean, I don't know. I feel like what they've done is they've taken what used to be, a pretty bad situation, because people kept asking me, when's the KV-1S nerf? When's the KV-1S nerf? We need something done about this. And they ended up, instead of making a nerf to it, they dropped it down a tier, replaced it, and instead they've added a whole new depth to Tier 5 and 6 with the KV-85, which, will most likely be using the 100 millimeter gun. And that's a whole different tank. It's a whole different play style, and it's great, and it's cool. And the KV-1S down at Tier 5, which is faster, and it's a tank that's not really, it doesn't really have much to compare to aside from maybe the T1 Heavy, perhaps, something like that, except maybe a slower firing gun. Exactly.
Because especially at Tier 6, the KV-1S often overshadowed a lot of the other options available, like the M6, the T150 even. Isn't that one that came to mind? The RL-44, which was a little bit more of a quirky tank, but still good in its own right.
And
incoming Unicum about to say the RL-44 is the worst thing ever conceived by mankind. You idiot! Gosh, what's wrong with you? Uninstall right now. Ugh.
Oh, but they probably already think of us that way anyway. So
yeah, good point. Oh my gosh, you're still green. Green. Green's the color of Christmas trees, bro. I don't know where I'm going with that.
I don't know where you were going either. I was like,
green like barf.
You gonna make more green references.
I hate arrogant Unicums. If you're a Unicum and you're a cool guy, that's great. But if you're just a huge jackass, then get out. Yeah. There's that. I mean, I'm pretty sure the only people who are going to be offended by that comment are huge jackasses, so I'm not really doing anything wrong there, am I?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay. But yeah, we're about we're about like 10 minutes away from the hour-long mark with this episode. So I thought this would be a bit shorter, but it turns out with Matt back here, we can get more conversation out of that, which is nice. We get quality and quantity. You can have your cake and eat it too. But Matt, you wanted to say something about Red Orchestra 2 before we concluded.
Oh yeah, we have time. Yeah. Actually, I'm really glad that we had the time to talk about this. One of the coolest parts of Red Orchestra 2 I think, is the tanks. And maybe not just the gameplay in them.
Sorry about
but
that. There goes the
you can
phone.
actually...
My case of adamantium protected my phone. Go on.
Anyway, but one of the coolest parts about it was that you can go to the different positions in the tank. And that's not something you see in World of Tanks. That's not something you see in War Thunder. It's a very unique thing. And when I say that you're at each position, I'm sure anybody that's played Battlefield will go, oh, but you have your driver and your gunner and your tanks, and in your IFVs you have like passengers and things like that, and they can see out. I mean, you literally switch to like where your commander is sitting, and you literally switch to where your driver is sitting and looking at the front viewport. And it feels very cramped. It feels very confined.
It's kind of like the IL-2
it's one of the
tanks, although it's not a dedicated tank sim. But
it does have a lot of realistic elements to it.
Yeah.
Right. And I really like how it did that. As the gunner, you can look through the periscope, or you can look through the gun. As the driver, you can look through your periscope. You can turn out from your hatch. Same with the commander. You can look out your commander's hatch. You can pull up out of there, or you can sit down and look out through all the viewports. And I just like how it's set up. Because mainly you have your Panzer IVs and you have your T-34s, and it's quite simple. And the interiors of each one look really cool. It's actually one of the most immersive experiences I've ever had, even in a game not solely focused on single player, or even just like a full-on simulator. And I think it's something that's done that really well and in a really cool manner. What does this have to do with World of Tanks and War Thunder? Not that much, actually, aside from the fact that there's tanks in it. But I thought it's a bit of an honorable mention because I just love this game, and I've really grown to love it in the past few weeks.
I think it would have some kind of relation to what we're talking about, too, because, I mean, if I were given the choice between quantity and quality, like if you're talking about elements in a sandbox. So, for instance, IL-2 compared to War Thunder. War Thunder has all of these planes, but a good chunk of them aren't even fleshed out with cockpits or flight models. IL-2 Battle of Stalingrad has a very small amount in comparison. Planes that actually operated either in the Russian Air Force or in the German Air Force during the war, in Stalingrad. I think about like 7 or 8 planes total. But they all have very, very intricately put together flight models and cockpits, and it just, like, the nuances of it, like the atmosphere, like you're sitting there in the cockpit and you can look around and control each individual part of the machine as if you were actually, like, in the cockpit itself. You can move around, like you said, in Red Orchestra. You can move depending if the vehicle has multiple seats or spaces for crew members. You can move in between, certain areas, like the gunner's port or the observation port, for certain types of bombers. Very, very intricately put together. And I think while War Thunder is approaching things in a very, very different manner, and again, this show isn't supposed to be about picking on War Thunder, but I think that if, it's a complicated thing to approach, because I applaud Gaijin for introducing content that makes sense, like early tier German tanks, to counteract the Russian horde that they have to face at early tier, like the T-50s and various versions of the T-34. But at the same time, without structure, without a setup, you gotta take that into account. Okay. But that's a good game to mention, too. We might get to talk about it every once in a while on this show, depending on how it comes together. Alright. I guess that about concludes this episode of the Russian Bias Podcast. You got anything else to say?
Not really. I mean, we covered just about what we wanted to cover. Yeah.
Alright.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
I think we're good.
Okay, folks, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode. You guys didn't just hear that. No, thank you so much for tuning into this this episode of the Russian Bias Podcast. In the future, I will have something a little special cooked up for you guys that has to do with War Thunder balancing and stuff like that, because that's all I talk about on this channel. So there's that. Okay? Спасибо, товарищи. До свидания.